There's a particular moment every long-term investor eventually runs into. You glance at your account, spot the balance, and for a split second, you're sure the number's a mistake. Not a bad mistake. The account grew more last month than you actually put into it. You didn't change anything. No raise, no side hustle, nothing new. The money simply outworked you. Money, retirement, and the strange calm some people carry around their finances while others white-knuckle every dip in the market. These are things worth spending a genuinely unreasonable amount of time thinking about. And after years of looking closely, one pattern keeps showing up. It's almost never about income. It's about whether you've crossed certain invisible thresholds. Milestones your bank statement never labels, that quietly reshape the entire emotional experience of building wealth. Most people picture wealth building as one long, flat grind. Save, 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 and hope it works out. That picture is wrong. Wealth building happens in distinct stages, and each one feels nothing like the last. The habits that carried you through the earliest stage can actually work against you 2 stages later. And oddly enough, the milestone people obsess over most, crossing $1 million, isn't even the one that reshapes your life the most. So here are 5 specific points along that road. The places where the math shifts, where the psychology shifts, and where, once you notice them, your entire relationship with money starts to change. Worth saying up front, because it matters. None of these milestones depend on a particular salary, a particular career, or some quiet inheritance nobody mentions. They're mostly a function of time, consistency, and knowing exactly which stage you're standing in right now. Once that pattern clicks, you'll spot it everywhere, in your own numbers, in friends who seem oddly unbothered by money, even in the offhand way certain relatives talk about retirement. It was never luck. They just already knew which milestone they'd cleared. Start at the beginning, because this first one gets brushed off way too easily, the first $100,000. Charlie Munger's old line was that the first 100,000 is the hardest, and he wasn't exaggerating for effect. If you're setting aside a meaningful share of your income, crawling from 0 to 100,000 can eat up 5, 6, even 7 years, grinding unglamorous years where you're supplying almost all the momentum yourself. Growth barely shows up on the chart. Put in $10,000, get a decent market year, and you might see $600 or $700 of gain. That's a nice dinner, not a life-altering sum. Picture someone in their late 20s, steady job, disciplined saver, checking their retirement account 4 years in, and finding roughly $60,000 sitting there. It feels like barely any progress at all. What they're missing is that this is the most important work they'll ever do, and not because of the dollar figure. It's because they're constructing the machine, the habit, the automatic transfer, the reflex of leaving that account untouched, no matter what the headlines are screaming that week. This is exactly where most people give up, by the way. Not because the strategy failed, but because it felt like it was failing. Nothing dramatic is supposed to be happening yet. The first 100,000 was never really about the money. It's proof of concept, proof to yourself that you can actually see this through. So if you're still in this stretch and it doesn't feel rewarding, remember, the milestone isn't the balance, it's the streak. Every contribution, no matter how small, is compounding evidence that you're someone who follows through. One more thing about this stage worth flagging. It's also where people are most likely to measure themselves against the wrong yardstick. Social media makes it worse. Someone stumbles across a stranger online casually mentioning a 7-figure portfolio and instantly feels behind, with no idea that person is 15 years further along, or started from a completely different set of circumstances. Comparing your own first 100,000 to someone else's crossover point is like comparing mile 2 of a marathon to somebody else's mile 20. Same course, entirely different race. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The second milestone, and honestly, the one that occupies more of my thinking than almost any other figure in personal finance. Call it the crossover point. It's the moment your portfolio's growth in a given year exceeds everything you personally contributed that same year. Sit with that for a second. There's an actual point where the market, working quietly in the background, starts outperforming you at your job, depending on your savings rate and how the market cooperates. This tends to land somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000, though aggressive savers can hit it noticeably sooner. Imagine someone putting away $15,000 a year. For a long stretch, that $15,000 is the primary force behind their growth. But once the balance clears a certain line, an ordinary year in the market can add more to the account than an entire year of paycheck contributions ever did. That's the crossover, and psychologically, it's enormous. For the first time, you're no longer the main engine driving your own progress. The money is. A lot of people get this milestone wrong. They assume it means you can stop contributing. You can't, not yet. What it actually signals is a shift in your relationship with the money itself. You start worrying less about squeezing an extra $50 out of this month's budget, and more about not doing anything careless that derails compounding that's already well underway. Protecting the machine becomes more valuable than feeding it. This is also, honestly, the first point where a lot of people start believing, not as an idea, but as a feeling, that this is actually going to work. Before the crossover, retirement lives on a spreadsheet. After it, it starts to feel real. There's a strange side effect that tends to show up here too. Market dips start to hit differently. Before the crossover, a 10% drop mainly just means less money flowing in. After it, that same drop can erase an entire year's worth of contributions in a single afternoon, at least on paper. That can rattle you if you're not braced for it. But here's the reframe that actually helps. Once you're past the crossover, temporary drops matter less to your long-term trajectory than they used to, because the compounding underneath is already carrying most of the weight. The dollar size of the swing gets bigger. The real threat to your plan usually doesn't. Milestone 3 is quieter, and plenty of people sail right past it without ever noticing. This is what's sometimes called the coast point. The moment your existing portfolio, left completely alone with no further deposits, still grow into enough to fund retirement by the time you actually need it. This one sneaks up on people because it isn't a fixed dollar figure that applies across the board. It's personal, tied to your age, your target retirement age, and how much you'll need each year once you get there. Here's the wild part. Plenty of people cross this point without realizing it, sometimes years before they ever stop contributing. Say someone's in their late 30s with a solid portfolio already built. If they actually ran the numbers, they might find that even if they stopped adding money today, no more automatic transfers, nothing, the portfolio would still compound into a comfortable retirement by the time they hit their 60s. But they don't know that, so they keep grinding at the same pace, sacrificing the way they did in their 20s, long after it's strictly necessary. None of this means you should stop contributing the second you hit coast. Most people keep going anyway because it speeds everything up and builds in a margin of safety. But knowing you've crossed that line changes how the whole thing feels. Saving stops being survival and becomes optional intensity, and that distinction matters more than people expect. There's a particular kind of stress that comes from believing you have to sacrifice, and a completely different feeling that comes from realizing you're choosing to. This is a milestone worth actually calculating because most people never bother. Once you know exactly where that line sits, you get to decide how close to it you want to live. I'd argue this is also the milestone most tied to burnout, or the absence of it. People who never figure out their coast point tend to hold the same financial intensity for decades. Same aggressive budget, same refusal to spend on anything enjoyable, same low-grade money anxiety, even after they've technically already won. Finding this number doesn't obligate you to ease up. It just means whatever easing up you eventually do is a deliberate choice instead of an accident. Milestone 4 is the one everyone talks about, and honestly, the most overrated in terms of what it actually changes: the $1 million mark. Here's a myth worth clearing up immediately. $1 million doesn't mean what it used to, and it doesn't mean what most people assume it means today either. It isn't a finish line. Depending on where you live and the lifestyle you want, $1 million portfolio might comfortably fund a full retirement, Or it might just be a solid checkpoint on a much longer road. The number itself carries no magic. What is real, though, is the psychological shift that happens around it. There's something about crossing that seven-figure line that changes the way people talk to themselves. Before it, there's often a low hum of anxiety. Am I actually going to make it? After it, for most people, that anxiety softens into something closer to cautious confidence. Not because the math suddenly changed overnight, but because crossing a symbolic line does something to how safe you feel. I've come across people who hit this milestone and barely reacted because they'd already internalized the crossover point years earlier. $1 million was just a number the account happened to pass through on its way somewhere else. And I've come across people who felt an enormous weight lift because up until that exact moment, some part of them genuinely doubted it was possible. Same balance, completely different emotional experience, entirely dependent on what came before it. The mistake to avoid is treating the $1 million mark as the goal itself. It's a checkpoint, not a destination. Build your whole identity around reaching it, and you risk feeling strangely hollow once you do, because the next question is always going to be, okay, now what? Better to treat it as one deeply satisfying mile marker in a much longer race you're already running well. There's also a quieter version of this milestone that rarely gets discussed. The first time your portfolio drops by more than your annual salary in a single bad month, and you realize you're okay. Not thrilled, not celebrating, just okay. That moment tends to arrive somewhere around this same stage, and it teaches something no amount of reading about investing can teach you in advance. That you can actually withstand volatility at a scale that used to feel unimaginable. That's a milestone in its own right, even without a number attached to it. Which brings us to the fifth, and in a lot of ways the most consequential milestone on this list. The 5 years right before retirement. This is the stretch nobody warns you about enough. Up to this point, the strategy has stayed fairly constant. Grow, contribute, stay invested, ride out the drops. But the 5 years before you plan to retire, and honestly the first few years after, are a completely different game. This is when something called sequence of returns risk becomes the single biggest threat to everything you've built. Here's the concept in plain terms. It isn't just about the average return your portfolio earns across your lifetime. It's about the order in which those returns actually show up. Two people can post the exact same average return over 30 years and end up in dramatically different places, purely because of when the bad years happen to land. A downturn during your accumulation years is almost a non-event. You keep contributing, keep buying at lower prices, and you recover. That same downturn hitting right as you start withdrawing money is an entirely different story, because now you're pulling cash out of a shrinking pot, which locks in losses in a way that's tough to reverse. Picture two retirees with identical portfolios, identical withdrawal amounts, identical 30-year average returns. One retires right before a rough stretch in the market. The other retires right before a strong one. Everything else equal, wildly different outcomes. Sometimes a gap of hundreds of thousands of dollars across the course of a retirement. That's not vague bad luck. That's the 5-year window doing exactly what it does. This is why so many people adjust their approach as this window approaches. Building up cash reserves, dialing back how aggressively they're invested, seriously considering a bucket-style strategy so they're never forced to sell investments at a bad moment just to cover living expenses. None of that comes from fear. It comes from recognizing that the rules genuinely shift this close to the finish line, and that the last stretch has to be played differently than the first 20 years were. If there's one milestone on this entire list worth marking on a calendar and actually planning around, it's this one. Everything before it rewards patience. This window rewards preparation. It's worth saying plainly, this doesn't mean abandoning growth entirely the moment retirement comes into view. Shifting everything into ultra-conservative holdings too early creates its own risk, since retirements can easily stretch 2 or 3 decades, and a portfolio that stops growing too soon can run into trouble on the other end for entirely different reasons. The goal here isn't to stop growing, it's to make sure a single bad stretch of years can't unravel everything that came before it. So there you have it. 5 milestones that matter far more than the specific numbers most people fixate on. The first 100,000, proof that you can actually do this. The crossover point, where the market starts outworking you. The coast point, where sacrifice turns from requirement into choice. The psychological million, which changes how you feel more than what you can actually do. And the 5-year window, where the entire game quietly changes shape. Here's the takeaway. More than any specific number, wealth building isn't a straight line, and it was never supposed to feel the same at every stage. If you're grinding through that first 100,000 right now, and it feels like nothing's happening, that's completely normal. That's the machine getting built. If you've crossed the crossover point, and you're starting to sense that you can ease off the intensity a little, that instinct might be more accurate than you think. And if you're closing in on that final 5-year stretch, treat it as your cue to stop thinking like an accumulator and start thinking like someone protecting what they've already built. None of this requires predicting the market, picking the perfect investment, or being smarter than everyone else. It just requires knowing which stage you're actually standing in, so you stop applying the wrong strategy to the wrong moment. That's the whole game, honestly. And if you take one thing from all of this, take this. Every single person who's ever reached a comfortable retirement passed through that first, slow, unglamorous $100,000 stage first. There's no version of this story that skips it. So if that's exactly where you are right now, you're not behind. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly the work that carries you to the next milestone. If this helped you see more clearly where you stand on your own journey, stick around and subscribe for more honest, no-hype conversations about money and retirement.